It's because it's so beautiful, even the description of the boat.
And it's
crossing.
beautifully translated by that. So in the English, it's so
Yeah,
beautiful.
so I'll do it a little bit even more than I was going to. Not a breeze stirred the air. The lake lay smooth and flat, and would have appeared motionless but for the slight trembling and rippling of the moon, which was mirrored in the water from the sky above. Reminded when we were crossing the bridge.
A little louder, Michael.
Today. A little louder?
Yeah, please.
The lake lay smooth and flat, and would have appeared motionless but for the slight trembling and rippling of the moon, which was mirrored in the water from the sky above. The only sound you could hear was the dull lapping and slow splashing of the water breaking around the piers of the bridge, and the rhythmic slapping of two oars slicing the blue surface of the lake, coming up dripping and dipping back in again. The wake of the boat formed a rippled streak behind the stern as the boat drew farther and farther away from the Lido. The silent passengers, twisting their heads to look back, gazed at the mountains and the moonlit village, dappled in places by broad shadows. They could make out the houses, the huts. Don Rodrigo's big palace with its flat tower rising above the pile of humble dwellings on the hillside of the promontory, standing upright in the shadows. His house looked like a cruel master in the midst of a slumbering group, both keeping vigil and contemplating a crime. Lucia saw it and shivered. She allowed her eyes to slowly follow the descent of the slope to their village. Gazing at the far end, she could see her cottage, the thick foliage of the fig tree rising above the courtyard wall, and the window of her room. Sitting as she was in the bottom of the boat, she rested her arm on the edge, laid her face on her arm as if to sleep, and wept to herself. Farewell mountains rising from the waters and reaching to the sky. Jagged peaks familiar to one who has grown up among you, etched in her mind, no less clearly than the faces of those she holds dear. Farewell rivers whose roaring she knows as well as the voices of home. Farewell small white villages clinging to the slopes like flocks of grazing sheep. Nothing could be sadder than the footsteps of one who, having grown up among you, must take her leave. Such a moment crushes the fantasies of a man who departs freely, dreaming of seeking his fortune elsewhere. Dismayed to have ever resolved such a thing, he would turn back but for his dreams of wealth. The more he advances across the plain, the more his weary eyes are repelled by the unending sameness. The air feels heavy and dead. Dejected and confused, he enters the tumultuous city, unable to breathe among house after house, street after street. Standing before buildings admired by many a foreigner, he thinks, with restless desire, of the fields in his home village, the little house that caught his eye long ago, which he will buy once he returns to his mountains, a wealthy man. But what about a girl who has never nursed even a fleeting desire to leave the mountains, who has pictured her future in that setting only to be cast out by a perverse force, torn in a single moment from her most cherished habits and fondest hopes? She leaves the mountains behind to follow in the footsteps of strangers she had no wish to meet, unable to even imagine a moment when she might return. Farewell childhood home, where lost in private thoughts, she had learned to hear the difference between normal footsteps and the footsteps of the youth she awaited with a mysterious fear. Farewell home she might never know, at which she had stolen many a blushing glance, the home where she had envisioned a married life, serene and lifelong. Farewell church, where peace of mind has so often returned while singing the Lord's praises, where her marriage banns had been posted and the Mass prepared, where the secret yearning of her heart was supposed to be solemnly blessed and love ordained and made holy. Farewell, he who gave you such bliss is everywhere and would never trouble the joy of his children, except to make it more certain and great. Such was the nature, though not the letter of Lucia's thoughts, which differed only slightly from those of her two fellow pilgrims, as the boat brought them closer to the right bank of the Adda.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's a beautiful section. You can tell the approach to the prose is a poetic one.
Yeah.
Because he did write poetry too.
Yes,
but,
yeah.
and, that was beautiful. Maybe we should have some questions, maybe answer. Maybe. You have questions? Somebody? Anybody?
Yes.
What year was it written, or what period?
Sure. I mean, if I talk about the whole period from like 1821 to 1840, the first edition was 1827, and this was between 1840 and 1842 in installments.
And you said he did 3 versions.
Yes, because the first version was unpublished.
Oh,
And it's only recently. There is so much attention to this in Italian scholarly circles. There's just, it never ends. And so I think that it was maybe 20, 30 years ago that they published the first version for people interested.
Did you work with all 3 versions?
Excuse me?
Did you work with all 3 versions?
No, only with the final. I mean, I was aware of the 3. I'm looking at them now more closely because as I have to start lecturing on it and stuff, then I have to, sort of, if I'd even started to go into that type of Manzoni scholarship, I would have never, ever finished it. I mean, it would have never ended, so.
Well, as it is, more or less, how long would you say it took? What was the
It took me?
gestation period for the?
I mean, I sort of say 10 years, but it was more like 15. I mean, I had started like I was going to say 1804, in 2004, and then stopped because I was always juggling a lot of things.
Yeah.
And I started again, like I think in 2011, and stopped to finish my dissertation, and then I just really dug in, realizing I would never finish it if I juggled. So.
Well, it's clearly a work of love. I mean,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you had to put aside the work of love to make some money to pay the rent now and then
Exactly.
go back to this work
Yeah.
of love.
Yeah, I was able to finish by, getting breaks, going to a residence here and there. I had a fellowship at Princeton, translator in residence that was very helpful. I went to Italy. I had like a month on Lake Como in Bellagio, which was perfect because from my window I could see the lake. And I mean, as you can see here, I mean, Manzoni loves to describe the landscape, and the landscape of Lake Como is unusual. I lived in Como also myself, and between 1975 and 1982-3, I lived in Italy, first in Milano and then Como, so I knew the places. But on the lake there, not from Como itself, but as you enter the lake, there's the mountains all along the lakeside, which make the sun fall in different ways, on different places. So when you look out, there's always this variety. And what's unusual about Lake Como, by comparison to maybe, Lake Maggiore, is that you have both the patrician villas, of the Milanese aristocracy that would go there for their vacations, and these fishermen's villages. So you have this great variety, still today.
Wow.
So your explanation for why this book isn't better known in English is the previous translations were all sort of flat?
I would answer this. First of all, it was well known in the 19th century, and people during the Grand Tour,
Right. Well, so is
knew it.
Scott, but he's
Yeah.
not read that much anymore
it's true.
today.
I think, at the time that I think around 1950, Archibald Calhoun came out with a version which I think did well. I haven't really looked at the history. It did okay. But I think that the most compelling part of it, it's sometimes people just look at plot. And it is unusual for its digressions and stuff.
Right.
And I think the beauty is the language. And I think there's also so many observations about human nature and about human psychology where he is way ahead of his time. I think his portrait of women is way ahead of its time, a portrait of their inner lives, of both Lucia and the nun. So I think that when I look at those, I did look at the previous versions, like after I was done, to help me to see if I got anything, if I was like way off. And I noticed that they were ignoring that linguistic aspect.
So you think that's because there are so many foreign language novels,
Yes.
19th century and earlier than that,
Yeah.
that are like household names in English.
Yes, yeah.
And this has been around almost 200 years.
Yes.
It still hasn't made.
It's absolutely. Yeah,
It
absolutely.
hasn't entered into
So, and that was,
culture that way.
like I say, I was saying to Canio earlier in Italian, I would say that was a scommessa, that was the bet that I made. But I felt like, you know what, it was a challenge. You know, here I've spent my life translating, interpreting, trying to get Italian writers known. But the big challenge was, how do I get him known too? I mean, it's always a struggle in translation. You know, you do beautiful books that are well known and do well in Italy, throughout Europe, and they come here and nothing happens. You know, and somehow I felt he deserves a better reputation. And I'm seeing that attention now, so I really hope it will
Let's
last.
hope so, yeah.
Yeah. But the fact, I have to say, with the reviews, in addition to them, to it being reviewed, I've been very gratified that they really get it. That they really get it. Yes.
Actually, I was just wondering, you said they really get it, whether this moment in time now, with everything that's going on, just hearing your descriptions of the things that, the amount of different sort of thoughts and aspects of life then that were difficult and hard and unjust and all the different things. Do you think you may have published it at a propitious moment?
I mean, I was very late in delivering, and and definitely, I mean, on the one hand, certainly there's the obvious fact of, you know, this terrible pandemic and the remarkable parallels. I think you're right when I think of this moment and what this moment means too. I mean, I'm sure we're all still processing it ourselves.
Yeah.
I sort of feel like, I've been saying lately, I feel like Rip Van Winkle. You know, that I've sort of woken up to this changed world,
Right.
especially the post-pandemic world. But I think that there is certainly so much about human nature, so much about history, but also, you know, I think, yes, this is the right moment. I think that there's a seriousness of purpose to the way that he writes that I think is very compelling. You know, but I think, you know, when I think of the nun, when I think of Lucia, uncertainties, the search for something to anchor you in life, I think, is one that we all have right now. After having been unmoored, you know.
Yeah.
So speaking of Italian authors not that well known in this country, you're describing this as a love story. There's a lot about, you know, internal life. And I just wondered what you think, or what he might think of Elena Ferrante.
Yeah, the Ferrante, you know, that's interesting.
Translations.
Yeah, I tried to get Ferrante to write the introduction, actually, because I'm sure she's read it, you know. I think certainly the success of the Ferrante novels has made, you know, people more curious. It's been very good for the fortunes of Italian literature in America, I'll say, because she's a very good storyteller. She's succeeded in doing something that many Italian women writers in particular have wanted to do, which is to tell the history of Italy through a multi-volume work, you know. And so she's telling you the history of Italy from the 1950s to the 60s to the 70s, you know. It's very, you know, I lived in Italy in the 70s, and I think I like the third volume the best of the quartet because it tells really what those years felt like so much. And there's a lot of politics, and I don't know how much Americans can understand. I would say that Ferrante herself is happy about this. You know, what would Manzoni say? I think he would be disturbed by, you know, the immorality of the characters. You know, you know. I mean, there is that. There is a lot of betrayal. There is, you know, the narrator of the quartet, of course, does something horrible. Can't hide the fact. I think one of the interesting things about the quartet also is that they are not good people necessarily. I mean, this is a very disturbing pathological friendship. Saying pathological meaning, maybe that's the wrong word because that sort of means away from the norm, and it's often the norm, isn't it? That kind of very troubled friendship. You know, so he might recognize it, but he was a very shy man, and I think he definitely be curious. And I also think that the Italian is remarkable in Ferrante, you know, and who knows what he would say about it. You know.
The Italian is Ferrante's Italian in the.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's remarkable. So then I was going to segue into the translation because I thought what you said was really interesting in terms of, you know, what you said in English in terms of the translation. And, you know, here you have, you know, the Sicilian Italian, which really sort of like, I guess, isn't translated. There's
Well,
like-
actually, even in the original,
Yeah.
rather, not to correct you, but I mean Neapolitan rather than Sicilian.
Yeah.
And the novel, the Ferrante novels are always in Italian. And it says in Italian, and she said in dialect. But
Yes,
it doesn't.
yeah, yes.
But the
Okay.
film version, the movie version, uses dialect, which I
Right.
thought was a real addition. And the dialect is a huge issue. Yes. In a certain sense, of course, the advent of TV was the great unifying factor of the Italian language. But there are pockets of Italy where if someone wants to express themselves sincerely and from the heart, it's dialect. It's Naples, it's Venice, you know. Sicily, not so much, although I don't know it quite as well. I mean, when I was in Sicily the last time, they were speaking regular the kids among themselves. Milano, I would say, Lombardia, you know. I saw a movie just the other day at the New York Film Festival in Friulano, you know, which is Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, Udine, that area near Venice and stuff. So the dialect is, in a certain sense, is almost a return to dialect. There are great dialect poets. Filmmakers very interested in dialect. Pasolini, who many know, did the first anthology of dialect poetry. But it's hard to translate dialect, because to do it properly, you'd almost have to put it into another dialect. But dialect is so local that if you put it into like a Mississippi dialect, then it's going to shift the location to Mississippi. Some people talk about using, you know, Brooklynese, but then that makes it Brooklyn, you know. So how do you do that, you know? Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael, I have a couple of questions. I know there were a couple of film adaptations of I Promessi Sposi.
Yeah.
If you could speak about any of them, did you watch them? Were they helpful at all? Secondly, just more about your approach to translation and that you've worked on it for so long with gaps, let's say, then how did you maintain a thread of cohesion or consistency over that period of time?
Yeah, I'll answer your second question first.
Sure.
He changes style. He changes register. And so I was able to do different parts at different times. I saved some of the hardest parts for last, in a way, because he quotes a lot of the 17th century documents, the gride, the decrees, to make fun of them, the laws that were being passed to control violence, the violence of the bravi, you know, and which is basically the violence of the upper class, you know, just having wars with each other. And it's a very convoluted Italian, lawyerese Italian. That I did separately because it was like a whole other, it had to draw on another part of me. And dialogue, I've done some subtitling of films, which helped me when I did dialogue because for a film you have to just be very concise. You don't want people to spend a lot of time. But it made me see just how much potential there is. So I did go over I didn't translate them separately, but I definitely revised them separately. And so I think that there are so many moments that are so different. There's a long religious part in the middle. So I think it didn't hurt me. The revisions were extensive, first my own. Like I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it, you know, and then the editor sort of came in and so there was a lot of back and forth there. So I think, and I worried very much about that kind of consistency, and I think it was in the last go-around that, you know, I felt that I achieved it, but really, I might have spent more time revising it than translating it, you know. And in terms of the film adaptations, it's quite a few actually, quite a few. There was the first film was a silent film of around 1924, you know, of this. And then for television, there have been at least 3 TV series, and a new one I think is being filmed next year. So,
In Italy?
In Italy, and you know, I mean, I have seen one. I saw one in the '80s, which was an older version. And then there was this one that came out in '89, with some American actors too. Burt Lancaster, who, dubbing is very common in Italian films. So he's dubbed in Italian. He's made quite a few Italian movies, great ones. I almost like his Italian voice better, someone else dubbing him.
He'll always be the gatto pardo, right?
Yeah, exactly,
Right.
exactly. And I think I'm trying to remember who he plays. I think he plays Padre Cristoforo, he has that kind of gravitas to him. That I've only been able to find snippets of on YouTube here and there. But as for Italian school children, they read it, they have to, and they really enjoy seeing it on TV because it kind of helped them a little bit. And it would be an event, back, especially in the day when you had only 1 or 2 channels in Italy, and everyone would gather to see that week's episode.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. But, are you? Do you write poetry yourself?
No, I write. I'm not cut out for it. I think I write my own
But you have
stories.
a good ear for it because the
yeah.
passage you read was so poetic and beautiful, and the lapping and the stopping
Yeah.
and the slicing.
Yeah, I think I write poetry in my head, maybe, but not on paper.
And the
And
other
that's an
question is
interesting
whether-
question. Where is it? Where does the Manzoni stop and Michael
Yes.
begin? Right? I mean, yeah,
Well,
because
when you translate, it's funny, and also, in addition to your previous question, I've translated many, many different kinds of things. And I think that it really helped me, because there are so many different styles inside the book. So it would draw on different parts of myself, like, nonfiction type things, legal documents, I worked at the Italian mission all those years, and I interpret a lot. And doing simultaneous interpreting, you also have to hear a voice, and that also affects my style. Right? And in terms of, where does Manzoni end and I begin, it's true that when I don't want it to look like a translation, I want it to sound natural. And of course, what could be more natural than the sound of your own voice, right?
But my other question is Via Manzoni in Milano named
That's-
after Manzoni?
Yes, because Manzoni's house was right off of it. They had the Casa Manzoni, where I also spent some time working on the book.
I think almost every city has a Via Manzoni.
Yeah, yeah. So, and it's right near La Scala,
Yeah.
in Milano, so.
Well, for those of you who have always been saying, well, one of these days I'm going to be reading Promessi Sposi or The Betrothed, now's the time to do it. This is such a lively translation, a lively book. It doesn't read like a translation, it reads like a book. That was great. Thank
Thank
you.
you, thank you.
Oh, I want to thank you both so much. Canio, this has been wonderful, and Michael, we're honored to have you here. We're just thrilled. It's an occasion. It's a worldwide publishing event. So we do have some copies at the desk, and you might want to have the translator sign them. Okay. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. And another round of applause to Michael and Canio.